very exciting occasion. We have a great group here. I do want to acknowledge the presence of Paul Edmondson and Sir Stanley Wells, who are present from Stratford upon Avon. Reverend Paul Edmondson will be giving our final talk on June 1st. And that is also our Kirk Davis Jr. annual public Shakespeare lecture. Today, I have the very special task of introducing Sean Keilen. As you know, Sean is an extraordinary friend, colleague, and fellow traveler with me in all matters Shakespearean and scriptural. He shares my passion for theater as a living art form, and both of us are very blessed as faculty in the University of California to actually get to work with Shakespeare companies in and near our campuses. Sean also, amazingly, shares my passion for reading Shakespeare as a guide to how we might live and learn today. His perspective is Christian and mine is Jewish, and we are both humanists in the long Renaissance sense of the term, devoted to the life of letters and to the development of core virtues and values from the great writings and spiritual disciplines of world civilizations.
Okay, thank you, Julia, for that extremely generous introduction. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the death of a great human being and a great Shakespearean over the weekend. Audrey Stanley died quietly at home on Sunday at the age of 95. Now, I know many of you in the room today know Audrey personally, but for those of you who don't know her, she was the first woman to direct a production at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. She was the first person to earn a PhD in dramatic art at UC Berkeley. And she was also the first professor to be appointed in theater arts at Santa Cruz. Audrey was also the co-founder of the illustrious company of actors, formerly known as Shakespeare Santa Cruz. And she later became a leading patron of the new company. That company became in 2013, Santa Cruz Shakespeare. Audrey was my patron too. She was an evangelist for the principle that scholars and actors should work together and learn from each other different aspects of their craft. And without her personal encouragement and financial support, Shakespeare Workshop, that organization that's bringing me to you today and makes my participation in all of these collaborations with Julia and Irvine possible, it would never have gotten off the drawing board without Audrey. So I'd like to dedicate this presentation today to Audrey for all its imperfections. And although I'm relatively certain that she would think that what I'm about to say about this sonnets is sheer nonsense. So here we go. Julia and I are so very grateful for your presence and attention these past 6 weeks. It's been very inspiring and motivating for the both of us. And because I'm grateful, I want to manage your expectations for my presentation carefully. Unlike other speakers in our series, I'm not an expert on the Psalms. I've never studied them formally. I know them entirely from the experience of worship, and the version that I know and love best is the English translation by Miles Coverdale, which furnished the Book of Common Prayer with its Psalter from the 1540s until 1928, and parts of which still endure in subsequent prayer book revisions down to the present. For those of you who know the Psalms in Hebrew, Coverdale is doubtless likely to be unsatisfactory from time to time, but his translation has the advantage of being the translation that Shakespeare knew when he wrote the sonnets. I do study Shakespeare and I have written about the sonnets, but from my perspective, these poems are his most elusive and multifaceted compositions. I never work with them without feeling that the better part of what they mean has slipped through the net. So my presentation today is a first exploration of my topic, and I'm hoping to discover with you whether further exploration is warranted. I have a very modest goal, which is to suggest what we might gain by thinking about the sonnets together with the Psalms. More specifically, what we might gain by reading the sonnets with some awareness that Shakespeare's era read the Psalter not only as lyric poetry, but also as practical wisdom for living a virtuous life. So To put the sonnets in conversation with the Psalms is to swim against the current of two enduring ideas in criticism and scholarship. And one idea concerns the nature of sonnets and psalms as literary forms, the other, the nature of Shakespeare's wit in the sonnets in particular. And I'll take those ideas one by one. So first, there is a misconception that Reformation England made a distinction between the psalm and the sonnet that was as fundamental as the difference between the sacred and the profane, or the spirit and the flesh. This notion is flatly contradicted by the fact that many Catholic and Protestant writers in the early modern period composed sonnets and sonnet sequences with religious themes. As you've heard in this series, the first sonnet sequence in English by Anne Locke is a pious meditation on Psalm 51. John Donne and George Herbert, two Anglican divines, both wrote sonnets. Donne's sonnets run the gamut from sexual obsession to rapturous piety. And then there's Edmund Spenser, perhaps the greatest of all the late Elizabethan poets. He wrote his sonnet sequence, the Amoretti, in the style of Petrarch, but he also meticulously organized it according to the schedule of psalms and lessons from the Old and New Testaments that appears in the Book of Common Prayer for 1594. Which was the year that he courted and married his second wife, Elizabeth Boyle. Here is the 68th sonnet from the Amoretti, the one that falls on Easter Sunday in the sequence. It's a prayer addressed to the resurrected Christ that turns into an appeal to the poet's mistress to give and receive love according to a pattern that the scriptures set forth. And I wonder if there's someone in the audience who would like to read it.
Paul Edmondson has expressed interest in reading for us.
Paul, please, I would be honored if you would read this sonnet.
Most glorious Lord of life, that on this day didst make thy triumph over death and sin, and having harrowed hell, didst bring away captivity thence captive, us to win. This joyous day, dear Lord, with joy begin, and grant that we, for whom thou didst die, being with thy dear blood clean washed from sin, may live for ever in felicity. And that thy love we weighing worthily, may likewise love thee for the same again. And for thy sake, that all like dear didst buy, with love may one another entertain. So let us love, dear Lord, dear love, like as we ought. Love is the lesson which the Lord us taught.
Thank you so much for that beautiful reading. So Psalms 111 and 118 are two of 6 psalms that the Book of Common Prayer assigns for reading on Easter Sunday in 1594, and their echoes can be heard in Spenser's sonnet. While he was writing the Amoretti, Spenser drew from Coverdale's Psalter, which was widely available in conjunction with the Book of Common Prayer and in the Great Bible. He also used the later Geneva Bible of 1560. So Spenser's use of joy and joyous in line 5 harkens to verse 15 of Psalm 118 in the Geneva Bible version of the Psalter. The voice of joy and health is in the dwellings of the righteous. The right hand of the Lord bringeth mighty things to pass. Line 8 points to verse 17 of that psalm. I shall not die, but live and declare the works of the Lord. Spenser's 6th and 7th lines evoke the covenant that Psalm 111 praises in verse 9. He sent redemption unto his people. He hath commanded his covenant forever. In the following verse, Psalm 111 concludes with an allusion to Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all they that do thereafter. And Spenser's sonnet likewise concludes with a lesson about love. The ineradicable idea that psalms and sonnets have no common ground may have originated in English translations of the Psalter during the mid to late 16th century. Here are a few verses from a poem of the virtue of the Psalms, which appears as a preface to the translation of the Psalter in 1567 by Matthew Parker, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. The singing man and poet must with grave divine concur, as David's skill all three discussed when he his harp did stir. Depart, you songs lascivious, from lute and harp depart. Whoops, sorry, they've departed. Give place to psalms, most virtuous, and solace there your heart. Ye songs so nice, ye sonnets all of loathly lovers' lays, ye work men's minds, but bitter gall, by fancy's peevish plays. These verses echo a more expansive argument that Coverdale made against sonnets 3 decades earlier in Ghostly Psalms and Spiritual Songs. In that early and incomplete translation of the Psalter, Coverdale explains that he has undertaken to set certain psalms to music in order, quote, to give our youth of England some occasion to change their foul and corrupt ballads into sweet songs and spiritual hymns of God's honor, and also to encourage them, quote, not to pass their time in naughty songs of fleshly love and wantonness, but with singing of psalms and such songs as edify and corrupt not men's conversation. Coverdale's argument expresses a conviction that he shares with every other Renaissance and Reformation humanist, namely that what we absorb through reading and study, and in this case through singing, becomes the very essence of who we are. For truly as we love, so sing we, he writes in a beautiful passage, and where our affection is, thence cometh our mirth and joy. In other words, what and how we sing reveals what and how we love and who we are, and by extension, I think, we're meant to understand that we can learn to love more wisely and become better versions of ourselves by changing what and how we sing. Here is that passage again in a context that reveals how the Psalter functioned as the focal point of a daily ascetic practice that aimed at moral and spiritual improvement, at overcoming appetites and infirmities and passions by internalizing teachings about the inconstancy of human nature and God's steadfast love and compassion. Would someone like to read this passage?
Kevin Karpus has volunteered to read.
Kevin,
Karpus. I'm sorry.
Please do.
All right. For truly as we love, so sing we. And where our affection is, then cometh our mirth and joy. When our hearts are tangled with the vain lusts of this corrupt world, then, if we be married and are disposed to gladness, our mirth is nothing but wantonness and inordinate pastime. And when we are sad, our heaviness is either desperation or else come carefulness of this vain world. Contrariwise, if our minds be fixed upon God, and we subdued to the holy desires of his Spirit, then, like as our hearts are occupied in the meditation of his goodness and love which he beareth towards us, even so are our tongues exercised in the praise of his holy name, so that when we are merry, our pastime and pleasure, our joy, mirth, and gladness is all of him. And as for our heaviness, when we are sad, as everything must have a time, it is either patience in trouble, repentance for offenses done in time past, compassion upon other men, or else mourning for our own infirmities, because our body of sin provoketh us so oft to the will of the flesh. And thus God causeth both mirth and sorrow of them that love him to work for their profit, as all other things to their best.
Thank you so much, Kevin. The bottom line here is that suffering or heaviness is as much a part of our nature as our capacity for joy. But by learning the Psalms, it becomes possible to change that suffering into self-knowledge and into charity toward others, and in the process to become an instructive example of what Coverdale later calls virtuous living. I have more to say about the Psalter as practical wisdom in Reformation England, but for a moment I want to acknowledge the second obstacle in the way of reading Shakespeare's sonnets in the light of the Psalms, and namely, that is our settled conviction about the nature of Shakespeare's own wit. If you want to discover where Coverdale's metaphysical distinction between sonnet and psalm continues to abide, Despite all we now know about the range and variety of sonnet writing at the end of the 16th century, look no further than recent commentary on Shakespeare's sonnets. With only rare exceptions, there are exceptions, have these poems ever been read as anything but audacious and formally sophisticated representations of erotic passion, as secular lyrics meant to entertain their readers as voyeurs and consumers of pleasure, rather than to edify their conversation with wisdom about the human condition. The first critical comment about the sonnets in 1598 presents Shakespeare as the reincarnation of the Roman writer Ovid, the author of 3 collections of, shall we say, R and X-rated love poems. The author of that comment, Francis Mears, suggests that Shakespeare's sonnets are like candy in the mouth. The sweet, witty soul of Ovid lives in mellifluous and honey-tongued Shakespeare. Witness his Venus and Adonis, his Lucrece, his sugared sonnets among his private friends, etc. Now, Mears' comment doesn't rule out the possibility that the sonnets might provide some kind of nourishment too. The word sugared doesn't have to mean sugary. It could mean sweetened, like a bitter medicine we might not want to take, even if it were good for us. Nevertheless, the idea that the purpose of Shakespeare's sonnets is to give pleasure, vicarious pleasure, and like Ovid's poetry, to arouse the reader to experience desire and imagine human sexuality, has been a seminal influence, no pun intended, on the history of criticism about these poems. For example, it's led to an almost universal presumption that the religious language that we find in Shakespeare's sonnets is some kind of joke. Here's one sentence from an essay about Shakespeare's sonnets in a recent scholarly companion that could exemplify the critical bias to which I am referring. The speaker's sexual use of religious language emphasizes how very worldly the sonnets are. Now, I would not argue that Shakespeare's sonnets are otherworldly. In fact, they are entirely of this world. The sequence invokes a time frame that begins with Eve and the apple in Sonnet 93 and ends with Judgment Day, for example, in Sonnet 55. Spatially, it unfolds between the sullen earth from which the lark arises at dawn in Sonnet 29, singing hymns, and the gate of heaven, the boundary at which the lark's ascent is stopped. Nor would I deny that Shakespeare's sonnets are capable of very sexy and irreverent displays of wit. I value them for that. In Sonnet 151, for example, the speaker responds to St. Paul's argument that flesh does not cooperate with spirit by noting that his own spirit has only to utter the name of his mistress and his body furnishes an erection fit for purpose. I am suggesting, however, that when we narrow the focus of our attention to this kind of wit in the sonnets and assume that all of Shakespeare's allusions to religion are sung in the key of blasphemy or sacrilege, we foreclose the possibility of other kinds of meaning, including the meaning to be drawn from his knowledge of the Psalter. Consider Sonnet 108, from which I borrow part of the title of my presentation. Julia, would you find a reader for this, please?
Yes, Kirk Davis, please.
What's in the brain that ink may character, which hath not figured to thee my true spirit? What's new to speak? What now to register, that may express my love or thy dear merit? Nothing, sweet boy, but yet, like prayers divine, I must each day say o'er the very same, counting no old thing old, thou mine, I thine, even as when first I hallowed thy fair name. So what eternal love in love's fresh case weighs not the dust and injury of age, nor gives to necessary wrinkles place, but makes antiquity for aye his page, finding the first conceit of love there bred, where time and outward form would show it dead.
Thank you, Kirk. In this poem, I, the speaker, reflects on the challenge of finding the right words to describe you, the sweet boy to whom the poem is addressed. Wordplay in, Wordplay in line 3 suggests why this task is difficult. It's difficult to find the right words because I'm talking about the living present, rather than the past. In this context, you and my feelings about you are always new and happening now. As the second quatrain begins, I acknowledge that the only words I have at my disposal are the words I used earlier in other poems. However, I also imply that when I use those same words to express my love and praise your merit, I am creating something new, for I count no old thing old. What it might mean to count no old thing old, I show you at the sonnet's turning point. There I inscribe a rhyming couplet within line 7, thou mine, I thine. This couplet is reminiscent of the verses that early modern couples engraved in the posy rings they gave each other when they married. Here is an example of the posy ring in the British Museum, inscribed with the words, let your life show your love. While the speaker in 108 says, I have no option but repeating the same old words, the sonnet shows how the repetition of familiar words can generate something of great value, something new. As the possessive pronouns thine and mine exchange the nominative pronouns with which they are associated grammatically, thou and I, the couplet in line 7 seems to profess or to renew wedding vows. In the second quatrain, I also compare my songs to prayers divine, unless prayers divine refers not to the kind of composition that I'm singing, but to the kind of singer I am. Perhaps prayers divine means members of the clergy, or more broadly, people who pray. In that case, I am saying that I am like a priest or a monk who's bound by his vows to say the daily office and recite the Psalms every day. In an earlier sonnet, I call myself an unlettered clerk who cries, Amen, Sonnet 85. I again compare myself to people who pray when I gesture to the time when first I hallowed thy fair name. This line invokes a key phrase from the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Other commentators have noticed that just before, let me show you that. Other commentators have noticed that just before Jesus teaches his followers this prayer in the Gospel of Matthew, he instructs them, when ye pray, use no vain repetitions as the heathen, for they think to be heard of their much babbling. For Stephen Booth, one of the great commentators on the sonnets, the speaker's apparent ignorance of this gospel exhortation is reason to conclude, quote, that the wit of the second quatrain derives from the speaker's self-betrayal in presenting evidence of sacrilege. And Helen Wendler, another great commentator on the sonnets, agrees with Booth when she argues more broadly that, quote, Sonnet 108 finds its wit in blasphemy. Imagine, however, that by evoking the Lord's Prayer in a sonnet that acknowledges the necessity of having to repeat oneself, the speaker is not the clueless butt of an irreligious joke. Suppose instead that he's performing an act of humility by confessing an awareness of his limitation, like prayers divine, who contemplate, recite, and internalize the Psalter's account of human frailty every time they pray the daily office. If we were not so biased in our preference for an impious Shakespeare, we might even detect a certain reverence in Sonnet 108, a reverence specifically for the capacity of old words to generate new life when repeated in the spirit that this poem associates with the ritual of frequent prayer. At the end of the third quatrain, antiquity is described as the servant of eternal love. In the final couplet, it becomes the place where love itself is bred. Colin Burrow, who discerns a pun on page as a young servant and page as a sheet of paper, suggests that the word antiquity in line 12 also means the writing of the ancients, or old writing. In that context, the answer to the questions the speaker poses in the first quatrain is his discovery at the end of the sonnet that the way to make my love and your merit new again is paradoxically to keep repeating words that are as familiar as the contents of an old prayer book. Before I pass beyond the history of commentary and the sonnets, I want to acknowledge that the Victorian era is virtually the only period that seriously entertained the idea that the Psalter informs Shakespeare's sonnets in a deep way. Thomas Carlyle's argument in 1840 that Shakespeare is, quote, the melodious priest of a true Catholicism, the universal church of the future and of all times, gives a sense of the spirit of that criticism. Here is an excerpt from Carlyle. Gideon, would you be willing to read this paragraph for us? I think it's totally in harmony with many things that you have been saying during the series.
Okay, I'll try my best. No narrow superstition, fanatical fierceness or perversion, a revelation so far as it goes, that such a thousandfold hidden beauty and divineness dwells in all nature, which let all men worship as they can. We may say without offense that there rises a kind of universal psalm out of this Shakespeare, too, not unfit to make itself heard among the still more sacred psalms, not in disharmony with these if we understood them, but in harmony.
Thank you so much for that reading. I knew you were the right person for it, Gideon. By the end of the 19th century, earnest efforts were being made to reconcile the sonnets with the scriptures. In 1896, Charles Ellis published Shakespeare and the Bible, 50 sonnets with their scriptural harmonies. And here is a typical page spread from the book. On the left, you see passages from scripture under the heading, The Fountain of Life. On the right, one of Shakespeare's sonnets with a headnote that interprets it religiously. And this is Sonnet 29, in which Julia has had very good things to say, about which she's had great things to say, in which Ellis detects the presence of 6 different psalms, as well as passages from the book of Isaiah, the Gospel of John, and Paul's letter to the Philippians. In The Messiahship of Shakespeare, published in 1901, Charles Downing went further than Ellis and other harmonizers. He argued that, quote, the great purpose and life work of Shakespeare was to develop and reconstruct Christianity in the light of the Reformation and the Renaissance. And in this context, he wrote the passage that you see here, from which I'll just read one sentence. The sonnet form a work essentially religious in nature. If there are any marks by which to recognize religion, they are the first psalms of a new religion. These feverish Victorian alignments of the sonnets and the Psalter produce very different results from a prurient modern criticism that focuses on Shakespeare's representation of human sexuality. They can be very, very far-fetched, but I welcome the diversity of their viewpoints in the critical tradition nevertheless. At the same time, they can be just as limiting as their secular counterparts in the sense that they tend to require us to decide whether Shakespeare was religious or sacrilegious or irreligious before we wonder what religious language is doing in the sonnets or how the psalms might have informed the sequence. So pausing the slideshow now, I prefer to see Shakespeare as neither dogmatic nor burlesque when it comes to the presence of the Psalter in the sonnets. I also don't believe that Shakespeare attempted anything as explicit or elaborate as Spenser's careful interweaving of sonnets, biblical texts, and Anglican liturgy. The question of what he did or did not believe about religion remains mysterious, at least to me. From my perspective, Shakespeare's allusions to the Psalter in the sonnets tend to be very diffuse and atmospheric rather than well-defined and pointed. The sonnets generally refrain from quoting the Psalter directly. The sequence is pervaded by the Psalms, however, and in this way, it perhaps reflects and responds to the experience of readers in the psalm culture that Hannibal Hamlin was talking about a few weeks ago, a culture that was saturated with these sacred texts from first light through nightfall. In the sonnets, only a few morsels of the Psalter remain in plain sight. For the most part, the feast has been fully metabolized and come the energy for reflection on a wide range of topics, including the inevitability of death, the prospects for sustaining life and beauty, the inconstancy of human nature, and the impact of our nature on our capacity to have faith in other people and form enduring bonds of love and trust with them. We like to read the Psalms as expressive, sacred lyrics, but it's not surprising that Shakespeare and his contemporaries also regarded them as sources of practical wisdom in a fallen world over which fortune erratically presides and our instincts run amok. As a boy learning Latin vocabulary and grammar in school, Shakespeare almost certainly was given a copy of the Psalter to imitate and translate until its content, no less than Latin, became second nature to him. Coverdale's version of the Psalms was not formally incorporated into the Book of Common Prayer until the revision of 1662, but readers often bound them together. Here is an edition of Coverdale's Psalter from 1549. Note the small format. It's just about 2 inches wide. And it was meant to be carried on one's person, perhaps as a bosom book in a pocket close to the heart. In addition to the Psalter, schoolboys were often worked with an English translation of Proverbs and Ecclesiasticus, also known as Sirach, for the purpose of Latin learning. Here's an example of one of those collections, the Books of Solomon, again, a bosom book to be carried around on one's person. These texts and the exercises that pupils use them to complete further contextualize the Psalter as wisdom writing, while also enlisting the study of biblical texts in the work of forming virtuous persons in the classroom. In framing the Psalter in this way, Shakespeare's teachers were only responding to what they found in the Psalms themselves. Coverdale's version of Psalm 19 proclaims that the law of the Lord is an undefiled law, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure and giveth wisdom unto the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right and rejoice the heart, and the commandment of the Lord is pure and giveth light unto the eyes. I'm going to call upon Julia here to read these verses from Psalm 19 in Hebrew, and then to read a modern English translation that appears below them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'll do my best. This is dedicated to my CBST Psalm reading group. Torat Adonai Timima Mishivat Nafesh. Edut Adonai Neimana Machkimat Peti. The teaching of the Lord is perfect, renewing life. The decrees of the Lord are enduring, making the simple wise. Pikudei Adonai Yesharim Misamche Lev. Mitzvat Adonai Bara Me'irat Einaim. The precepts of the Lord are just, rejoicing the heart. The instruction of the Lord is lucid, making the eyes light up.
Thank you so much, Julia. In Psalm 49, the focus shifts from the wisdom of God's teaching to the wisdom of the Psalter itself. My heart shall speak of wisdom, and my heart shall muse of understanding. I wonder if I could ask Shana to read this verse in Hebrew and its English translation.
Sure. Pi daber chachmot v'hagut libi sifunot. My mouth utters wisdom and my speech is full of insight.
Thank you very much. Or even better, consider the Psalter's starting point. Psalm 1 opens the book not with praise and thanksgiving or lamentation or penitence, but with a statement about the singular importance of learning God's teaching in every life, along with an exhortation to study and internalize that teaching without ceasing. Okay, so note that Coverdale's word law in verse 2 is a translation of the Latin word lex from the Vulgate Bible. But in Hebrew, Julia helpfully tells me, that word is Torah, not law, but teaching. Shana, could I ask you one last time to read us some Hebrew and its translation?
Sure. Ki'im besorat Adonai chafzo, uvesorato yihige yomam v'layla.
And the English, would you read that?
Sure. Rather, the teaching of the Lord is his delight, and he studies or he recites that teaching day and night.
Thank you. So here is Coverdale's version of Psalm 1 again. Let's read it in full this time. May I have a reader from the audience?
Yes, Priscilla would like to read.
Take it away, Priscilla, when you're ready.
Okay. Blessed is the man that hath not walked in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stood in the way of sinners, and hath not sat in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law will he exercise himself day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the waterside, that will bring forth his fruit in due season. His leaf also shall not wither, and look, whatsoever he doeth, it shall prosper. As for the ungodly, it is not so with them, but they are like the chaff, which the wind scattereth away from the face of the earth. Therefore the ungodly shall not be able to stand in the judgment, neither the sinners in the congregation of the righteous. But the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, and the way of the ungodly shall perish.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. The editors and translators of the Geneva Bible read Psalm 1 as an indication of the meaning and purpose of the Psalter as a whole. Whoever gathered the Psalms into a book, they reasoned, it seemeth he did set this psalm first in the manner of a preface, to exhort all godly men to study and meditate the heavenly wisdom. Their phrase, study and meditate, is closer to the Vulgate's verb meditatabur, but Coverdale's exercise may be a better translation of the Hebrew verb, I think it's hagah, is that right, Julia? Which means to utter or recite. The blessed man in Psalm 1 is the man who internalizes God's teaching by reciting it aloud, day and night, in the form of a spiritual exercise. John Donne and John Calvin also foregrounded the value of the Psalms as practical wisdom and as guidance for life. In this passage, in the passage from the second pre-Ben sermon that Shana shared with us last week, Donne says that David foretells what I and what any shall do and suffer and say in the Psalter. In that context, the Psalms minister instruction and satisfaction to every man in every emergency and occasion. Calvin calls the Psalter an anatomy of all the parts of the soul, and a mirror in which there is exhibited to us one standing, as it were, amidst the invitations of God on the one hand, and the impediments of the flesh on the other, girding and preparing himself for prayer. He believes that by praying the Psalter, men will be most effectually awakened to a sense of their maladies, and at the same time instructed in seeking remedies for their cure. The Psalter is no less a source of self-knowledge than it is a source of knowledge about God's teachings. Behind Donne and Calvin stand Saints Basil and Athanasius, two Greek-speaking bishops of the 4th century, whose writing about the Psalter greatly influenced its reception and use through the Reformation. We encountered St. Basil's homily on the Psalms in Hamlet's presentation 2 weeks ago. A translation of it was included in Matthew Parker's edition of the Psalter. Here's the passage in which Basil extols the applicability of the Psalms as wisdom for each person's life. And in the interest of time, and since we saw it before, I will pass over it. Athanasius, who also read the Psalter in this light, sought to make the Psalms available as a kind of technology for spiritual development by adapting ascetic practices that he admired in ancient philosophical schools and in contemporary Egyptian monastic communities for use by his urban congregation in Alexandria. In a famous letter about the Psalter to a correspondent named Marcellinus, Athanasius writes that just as in a mirror, the movements of our own souls are reflected in the Psalms, and the words are indeed our very own, given us to serve both as a reminder for our changes of condition and as a pattern and model for the amendment of our lives. This is a call upon readers of the Psalter, not only to read themselves into the Psalms, but also to write the Psalms in their own hearts in order to be transformed by them. In this regard, Athanasius's vision of devotional reading, which I think is reading aloud or singing rather than reading silently, is consistent with the spirit of one of Stoicism's core teachings about the way we ought to live. What you imagine frequently, your mind will become, for the soul is dyed in the color of its thoughts, writes Marcus Aurelius in the Meditations. Dye it then in a succession of thoughts like these. For example, where it's possible to live, it is also possible to live well. An abridgment of Athanasius's letter was occasionally printed with a preface, as a preface to the English Psalter, along with a table drawn from the letter's contents, showing readers how to identify specific psalms that were appropriate for the circumstances in which they found themselves. Psalm 90, for example, which you see illuminated here in the lower right corner, is recommended to the attention of readers who are at a loss to understand how best to live a life that's all too short, and, quote, wouldst know how Moses prayed to God, and in his meditation, recounting the brittle state of man's life, desired God to direct his short life, that he might follow wisdom. This psalm, Psalm 90, which appeals to God to, quote, teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom, is just one example of the Psalter's ubiquitous acknowledgement that death is an untranscendable ground of human experience, and also the context in which the Psalter's practical wisdom is meaningful and life-sustaining. Here are a few more examples of that teaching, which are memorable for me. Lord, let me know mine end, and the number of my days, that I may be certified how long I have to live. Behold, thou hast made my days as it were a span long, and mine age is even as nothing in respect of thee. And verily, every man living is altogether vanity, for man walketh in a vain shadow, and disquieteth himself in vanity. What man is he that liveth, and shall not see death? The days of man are but as grass, for he flourisheth as a flower of the field. For as soon as the wind goeth over it, it is gone, and the place thereof shall know it no more. Lord, what is man, that thou hast such respect unto him? Or the Son of Man, that thou so regardest him? Man is like a thing of naught. His time passeth away like a shadow. The Psalter's unflinching emphasis on the transitoriness of life evidently made a deep impression on Shakespeare. On the only occasion in all his works that he refers to the author of the Psalms by name, he concisely repeats what the Psalter says about death. Death, as the psalmist saith, is certain to all. All shall die. In the Sonnets, number 15 is the first poem in Shakespeare's sequence to take the full measure of the melancholy wisdom that we all stand under the authority of death. It's also the first sonnet to suggest that the speaker's poetry has the capacity to extend and renew life, if not to create it outright. Would someone like to read this sonnet aloud?
Ariane, are you able to read this for us?
Yeah, I think I can. When I consider everything that grows holds in perfection but a little moment, that this huge stage presenteth not, but shows whereon the stars in secret influence comment. When I perceive that men as plants increase, cheered and checked even by the selfsame sky, vaunt in their youthful sap, at height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory, then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you most rich in youth before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay to change your day of youth to sullied night. And all in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new.
Thank you, Ariane. That was beautifully read. So, what it means for a poem to extend or renew life is suggested by the concluding couplet of this poem. I prolong the presence of the pronoun you by repeating it 3 times, first drawing the rhyming word from line 13 into the middle of the next line and sounding it again. Then I repeat you a 2nd time as the sonnet's penultimate word. And finally, I turn you into something new, in fact, into the word new itself. New points back to you as it perpetuates the vowel sound of your personal pronoun. It also opens a path toward the future where you will be changed but continue to exist, just as the word new sounds very like you but is spelled quite differently. The life into which I engraft you in this sonnet is ultimately the life of the readers to whom the speaker refers in Sonnet 81 as eyes not yet created and tongues to be, which is to say, to us, who breathe life into you as we read the sonnets aloud. As Thoreau writes in his marvelous essay, Reading, quote, "A written word is the work of art nearest to life itself. It may be translated in every language and not only be read, but actually breathed from all human lips, not represented on canvas or in marble only, but be carved out of the breath of life itself. The symbol of an ancient man's thought becomes a modern man's speech." Sonnet 15's references to plants and to grafting suggest that the first 17 sonnets in the sequence, the so-called procreation sonnets, may be an extended imitation of Psalm 1, as well as a dazzling display of Shakespeare's ability to repeat the same lessons without becoming dull. In Psalm 1, the blessed man is described as a tree that will bring forth his fruit in due season, with leaves that shall not wither, whereas the ungodly man is compared to barren chaff that perishes. Sonnets 1 through 17 encourage a fair young man to marry and have children in order to ensure that his youth and beauty will survive. They also compare the refusal to procreate to self-love, self-deception, imprudence, greed, gluttony, waste, and murder. Number 11 is another sonnet from the opening sequence that seems to me to be an imitation or in dialogue with Psalm 1. In this poem, I'm not going to have us read it. In this poem, Psalm 1's distinction between the blessed man who studies God's teachings unceasingly and the ungodly man who doesn't is recast in the third quatrain as the difference between beautiful people who are made for store, that is for breeding or conservation, and ugly people who are condemned to perish without issue. Sonnet 11 is the only poem in the entire collection to use the word wisdom in any form, and that wisdom is aligned with a prominent echo from the Psalter. The idea that a human life lasts no more than 60 or 70 years. In its most literal sense, In its most literal sense, the wisdom that Sonnet 11 proclaims is that the world must be peopled. That's from Much Ado. But that's not much of an answer to the question that Shakespeare's evocations of Psalm 1 might be said to pose. How should one live? In thinking about the possibility that Shakespeare was alive to the Psalter and this question as he composed the sonnets, I've found it fruitful to focus as much on what the sonnets do as on what they say. Or to put it another way, I don't believe that the sonnets instruct us how to live, but I often have the sense that they are demonstrating a way of life, a way of loving another person, given the certainty of death and other unfortunate aspects of the human condition. Human beings are born into a changing world, and in that world, our bodies grow, flourish, and decline. Our spirits are inconstant too. The speaker in 123 declares that time shall not boast that I do change, this I do vow, and this shall ever be. I will be true despite thy scythe and thee. But when other sonnets reveal that he and the fair youth have betrayed each other with other lovers, we might find ourselves thinking about a lesson in Psalm 118. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put any confidence in man. And that lesson returns in Psalm 146, where human inconstancy, moral inconstancy, as against the steadfast love of God, is presented as a consequence of mortality. O put not your trust in princes, nor in any child of man, for there is no help in them. For when the breath of man goeth forth, he shall turn again to his earth, and then all his thoughts perish. In light of human nature, what can one do to ensure the survival of life and beauty through generations? One answer to the question is in the sonnets is to repeat the sonnets like prayers divine, as we saw in 108, or to engraft old stock into new life by creating a text that others will read in the future, as we saw in 15. I call your attention to the sestet of Sonnet 81, where the word rehearse, drawn from the lexicon of Shakespeare's works in the theater, infuses the practice of repeating aloud with grafting's life-giving spirit. What does it mean that the future shall rehearse your being in a sequence of poems that never reveal your name or what you look like or how your voice sounds or where you come from, or in short, who you are? To attribute more meaning to the theatrical term rehearse than perhaps it can bear, I think these lines mean that future readers of the sonnets will continue to restore restore your life by playing a part, the part played repeatedly by the speaker of the sonnets, who persists in putting his faith not in a steadfast God, but in another human being who is as fickle as himself. Helen Bendler's only reference to the Psalter in her commentary on the sonnets touches on exactly this point, on the invitation the sonnets extend to every reader to inhabit the role of I. And you'll have to take my word for it. I'll pass over that so I can get to the end and there's time for discussion. If we accept the invitation and play the speaker's part as we read the sonnets, we might learn what it's like to feel the steadfast love for inconstant beings that the Psalter praises as an attribute of God. According to Psalm 103, the Lord is full of compassion and mercy, long-suffering, and of great goodness. Perhaps the idea is that by having this experience every time we rehearse the sonnets, we will develop the capacity to love each other in this way, without forgetting the variable nature the speaker shares and that we share with the person to whom the sonnets are addressed. In these poems, I am a human being just like you, and like you, I need understanding and forgiveness. As we love, so sing we. So let me turn to my conclusion now by quickly drawing your attention to 3 poems that seem to me to be the essence of whatever lesson about life the sonnets might be said to offer in imitation of the Psalter. In Sonnets 91, 92, and 93, a mini sequence that focuses on the speaker's faithfulness and the fair youth's inconstancy, we can take the measure of a covenant for perpetuating a beautiful life through time. In Sonnet 91, I make an extended comparison between myself and other men who glory in high birth, talent, wealth, strength, possessions, sport, and horses. In contrast to them and the things they cherish, I say, thy love is better. This comparison rings with echoes of several psalms that proclaim the superiority of God and his teaching to all other sources of value. Here are a few of them on the screen, as well as the verses we have seen in Psalms 118 and 146, discouraging us from placing our trust in any human being. And I will pass over these to reach the end of my presentation. But then the concluding couplet of 91 strikes a different chord as it acknowledges the suffering I might incur as a consequence of my devotion to you. You are not God, after all, but a human being, as changeable as the world into which you were born. In Sonnet 92, I put a brave face on what I've discovered about my vulnerability to you by reasoning that because my life depends upon your love, I will cease to exist if you stop loving me. In that case, I would be free from the anxiety and fear of loss I suffer because I depend upon your humor and inconstant mind. It's difficult to determine the speaker's tone in these verses. Is it exasperated or farcical or despairing? Whatever the case may be, the idea that it would be better to be dead than alive passes quickly. Like the Psalter, the sonnets are generally a celebration of life. In the couplet, I acknowledge that the doubts and vexations I suffer because I love and depend on you are intrinsic to the human condition. And surprisingly, this acknowledgement turns my pessimistic thoughts in a much more optimistic direction. May I have one last reader to read this sonnet?
let's end with Paul Edmondson.
So shall I live, supposing thou art true, like a deceived husband, so love's face may still seem love to me, though altered new, thy looks with me, thy heart in other place. For there can live no hatred in thine eye, therefore in that I cannot know thy change. In many's looks, the false heart's history is writ in moods and frowns in wrinkles strange. But heaven, in thy creation, did decree that in thy face sweet love should ever dwell. Whate'er thy thoughts or thy heart's workings be, thy looks should nothing thence but sweetness tell. How like Eve's apple doth thy beauty grow, if thy sweet virtue answer not thy show.
Thank you, Paul. So, as I said a moment ago, these three poems are, from my point of view, a response to the wisdom that Shakespeare found in the Psalter, a sort of epitome of its wisdom about living and loving that focuses on the complexities of relationships between people rather than relationships between a person or a people and God. In 91, I acknowledge how vulnerable I am to your fickleness. In 92, I wonder whether it wouldn't be preferable to die than to live under those circumstances, which are nothing less than the human condition in a fallen world. In 93, I resolve to go on living, supposing thou art true. That's a leap into the unknown, a leap of faith, and not into the arms of the steadfast God of the Psalter, who will never forsake me, but toward you, another person, who might play me false, like the wife of a deceived husband, because it's in our nature to betray each other and ourselves. As Sonnet 93 continues, I acknowledge that I do not and I cannot know what is in your heart. My only options then are to trust you or to reject you. I choose to believe in you, whate'er thy thoughts or thy heart's workings be. There are plenty of reasons in Sonnet 93 to conclude that I am a glutton for punishment and love, that I simply can't resist a pretty face that might not tell the truth. On the other hand, if we are to enter into the spirit of the life-sustaining covenant in Shakespeare's sonnets, a covenant that we're invited to join the speaker in rehearsing again and again, like prayers divine, we might start here, with the poem that evokes the fall of Adam and Eve, in order to suggest what we risk when we place our trust in other people, and also to show us how to go on living with and loving them. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Sean. I'm going to unpin you so that we can reconnect as a group. We are
way over time.
We're technically over time, but we will continue a discussion here because that was such a profound and rich and multi-layered presentation. And we have such a great group here to respond to you. We know that some people will be leaving for teaching and other obligations, but those of you who can stay, please join me in thanking Sean for his teaching. And please let me hold forth, respond and comment. I don't know whether Paul would like to start us off since he'll be speaking next time. Yes, Paul has a comment, so I think Paul would like to, and Sir Stanley Wells, thank you again for being here.
Hi,
yeah.
hi, Sean. Thank you for that beautiful paper, exquisitely delivered. Thank you. And I want to just call our attention to the end of that quote by Charles Downing that you showed us from 1901. The Messiahship of Shakespeare, which I suspect is no longer, hasn't been for many years, a popular book. I read in the final part of that quotation, the singer, i.e. the singer of the Psalms, the Sonnets, it's Shakespeare, is as fervent as David in prayer and praise.
Yes.
Now, for me, that's about an openness of heart. And for me, that takes me very quickly to Wordsworth's sonnet, in which we read, "With this key, Shakespeare unlocked his heart."
Mm.
And it seems to me that David, and one of the things we, Jewish and Christian, adore about David, is his openness, his open bravery, and his brave openness. And I think of the David when I read that line, "The singer is as fervent as David in his prayer." I think of David dancing naked before the ark in 2 Samuel 6. I think of the David who makes the lament for Saul and Jonathan, his 2 beloved men, in 2 Samuel 1. I think of David as the author of Psalm 18, and David, as Shana beautifully discussed last week, as author of Psalm 51, after his sin, his awareness of sin with Bathsheba, and his orchestrated murder of Bathsheba's husband, even though they were divorced because he went into battle, Uriah the Hittite. So I think there's something actually quite profound there in thinking of all of what you just said about the sonnets in relation to the Psalms. And for me, it's about Shakespeare's openness, Shakespeare's daring to write these poems in the first place, whether they're just written for himself or whether we can even begin to imagine the people to whom they were addressed. Anyway, I know that's a comment, not a question, but I'm sure it's of interest, so I just offer it to you from Stratford upon Avon.
Thank you for staying up so late. Now, I mean, are you suggesting, Paul, that it's worth thinking about David as a sort of figure of what a poet is or ought to be, and that thinking about him in that way is an influence on Shakespeare's conception of his own poetic subjectivity in this project? Oh, he's gone.
I'm here, Sean. I think that's very interesting. That, I mean, and also if you read it retrospectively, I mean, let's face it, Shakespeare has become a sort of King David of literature, hasn't he?
He really has.
That sort of beginning of an ancestry that is somehow seminal, and we might even, if we were reading it differently, think about it as Shakespeare fashioning himself on the author of the Psalms, wanting to start a significant movement. I don't know, feeling called to do so, feeling anointed and appointed to do so.
Carlyle is really alive to the analogy that can be drawn between David and Shakespeare. So that passage is taken from this book on heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history. One chapter is called, the poet, and that's Dante and Shakespeare. But another chapter is called the prophet, and that's David, right? And so they are presented in Carlyle as parallel and analogous figures. And you can see him in the short passage I showed you, trying to bring those 2 different tracks to a point of intersection. So I think that's a great idea. Kirk, you have your hand up. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, first of all, I'm sure everyone would love to thank you, Sean, for a very thought-provoking and wonderful talk. My question is textual analysis. As you know, Professor Robert Watson of UCLA has these fancy computer tools. And I wonder if he applied those to the 150 Psalms and the 150 odd sonnets, if there might be some interesting discoveries. Have you talked with him?
I have not, but I love the idea of doing a quantitative analysis of the 1609 sonnets and either Coverdale's text or the Geneva Bible text. That would be interesting. I feel, as Hannibal was saying 2 weeks ago, I feel now that I've thought a little bit more about the Psalms that I am surrounded by them in the sonnets when I'm reading the sonnets. But when I sort of try to grasp that little firefly that's buzzing around in the dark, it sort of eludes capture. It's very rarely is it possible to say this passage is drawn from that other text. And when you do, for example, 70 years and 10, the phrase is often so commonplace that you can't say with absolute certainty that it's coming from this text rather than some other text or just common vocabulary. right? There's an amazing sort of common language circulating through the sonnets, which itself is probably influenced by the Psalter, right? But whether he's drawing, I mean, it's an academic's question: is he drawing from the common language or is he drawing from the Psalter, and why would that matter? But I will, maybe I'll write to him, see if he will crunch some numbers, literally numbers, verses for us. I agree, Gideon. He is drawing from everything. He's a great big sponge.
We have time for maybe one more question. I am still recording because we didn't have time for a conversation before.
I have a question.
Yes, Carolyn.
Okay, first, I mean, I love that beautiful paper, that beautiful talk. Thank you so much. It was exquisite. And I was writing everything down and showing the relationships between the sonnets and the psalms and all these, I mean, Carlyle, everybody who you brought up. And finally, it just, it occurred to me that you were doing an exquisite proof that Shakespeare is, in what we say in Judaism, midrash. And I was wondering, is there a word in Christianity that means midrash? And I just don't know. So I'm just asking you that question, if there is a term, because in Judaism, what midrash means is that we're looking at something highly spiritual that fills in the blanks within the scriptures and explains it more and brings it more to this present day. And is there a term or a word?
Inspiration, tradition.
Okay.
Paul
Okay.
Edmondson, if you're still there, what do you think?
Thank you, Caroline. As you were speaking, I thought Holy Spirit. When Jesus says in John 15, the Paraclete will guide you into all truth, I think midrash, I mean, that there's an equation there, that if Jewish culture continues to interpret the scripture and enlighten the scripture through midrash, then the Christian equivalent is the Holy Spirit that Jesus promises us will guide us into all truth. And what I have to say to you, you cannot bear now, he says, but the Spirit will guide you. And so that's the equivalent, I would say, of Jewish midrash is Christian Holy Spirit. But when Jesus was talking, of course, he was talking as a good Jewish boy, and so the equation it should be unquestionable in that sense. Thank you.
That's good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was really great.
Well, there's some wonderful commentaries here in the chat about this issue of what might be equivalent, including the 4 levels of interpretation, which are in both Judaism and in Christianity. I think the Alexandrian and Hellenistic periods are very interesting for the intermixing of Jewish and Greek and then Christian exegesis, and a lot of sharing there of wisdom. And Chokmah becomes Sophia, and Sophia in some ways becomes Logos. So there's a lot of very interesting kind of mutual insemination of these areas in that period. We are going to shut down for the day. We do have no class next week, no seminar next week. And then on June 1st, you got to hear from Paul Edmondson today, reading and in conversation. We've also put the link in my reminder emails. Paul has actually read all of the Psalms out loud on Spotify, and it's beautifully organized into little chapters. So you can hear Paul reading the Psalms if you would like on Spotify. And Paul Edmondson will be speaking to us as our Kirk Davis annual public Shakespeare lecture on June 1st. So please come. I want to also recognize Constance Fury, who is here today from Indiana University, who's written an important series of commentaries on Sidney and Luther and the Psalms. So I think we're developing a wonderful community of scholars and lifelong learners, community learners together in this group. And it's really great to have gotten to learn from Sean today.